Try to imagine an executioner who never wielded a weapon, someone who felt physically ill in the face of extreme violence, death, and the sight of blood, to the point of nearly fainting. Think of a bureaucrat, a man obsessed with ambition, willing to do anything to climb the hierarchy of power, even descending into the lowest depths of morality. Picture above all a person with an aggressive nature, but who was not actually cut out for physical brutality. As a young man, he dreamed of a military career, yet never participated in a battle. Despite this, he came to command one of the most powerful armed forces in the world, a life filled with constant contradictions. This is perhaps the most fitting portrait to describe one of the most disturbing, dark, and ruthless figures of the entire Nazi apparatus, the regime that spread terror throughout Europe for over 15 years in the last century. We are talking about Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was born into a wealthy family, so much so that he managed to convince his parents to intervene on his behalf and shorten his classical education path in order to enter the military academy early, motivated by the outbreak of World War I. Raised in a context steeped in nationalism, he immediately faced a demographic obstacle. Born on October 7, 1900, he was too young first to be admitted to the academy and then to take concrete part in the war. When he finally came of age, Germany was already in disarray. The army was retreating, and within a few weeks, the country would sign its surrender following the so-called November Revolution. In theory, his destiny seemed to be an ordinary career in the state apparatus, but his visceral nationalism, common to many of his peers, exploded in the months following the end of the conflict. He deeply despised the peace treaties, particularly that of Versailles, which many considered a national humiliation. As proof of this spirit, despite never having participated in actual combat, Himmler joined one of the numerous paramilitary corps of the time, groups composed of former soldiers who had refused to surrender their weapons, engaged in suppressing strikes, popular revolts, and attempts by the German Communist Party to establish Soviet republics, modeled after post-Tsarist Russia, which was also torn apart at that time by civil war. Thus, Himmler found himself rubbing shoulders with seasoned war veterans, despite never having had direct experience with weapons himself. Nevertheless, he still managed to earn their respect. Meanwhile, he completed his studies, becoming an agronomist, although he never practiced that profession. He chose another path, that of politics, which in the turbulent 1920s in Germany was far from dialogue and much closer to brawls and physical confrontation. A chaotic and violent politics, which he observed and followed, though never actively participating in clashes or beatings, a curious aspect for someone coming from the Freikorps. Even more surprising, considering that Himmler had long presented himself as a man eager to radically change Germany's destiny. His desire for transformation was so strong that he decided to join the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which under Adolf Hitler's leadership had taken on a strongly revolutionary imprint. This new radicalism of the movement culminated in the famous coup attempt known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Even though that action ended in failure, as is well known, Himmler remained on the sidelines. His participation was so marginal that he was not even charged. He was released almost immediately from preventive custody, so much so that for a moment he seemed to disappear from the scene. During the period when Hitler was imprisoned, Himmler grew close to Gregor Strasser, another prominent party figure, leader of the more extremist faction. This current aimed on one hand to seek agreements with more moderate parties, such as conservatives and centrists, and on the other to keep alive an idea of permanent revolution, similar to what was being attempted in Italy with fascism. Himmler assumed the role of Strasser's personal secretary, a position that began to give him some weight within the party structure. However, when Hitler was released from prison and decided to strategically reorganize the party, understanding that power could be conquered not by force but through elections, Himmler changed allegiances. Although Strasser was still considered a valid leader, he did not have the charisma of the Führer, so Himmler preferred to move closer to Hitler again, who appreciated his loyalty and began to reward him. He entrusted him with increasingly important roles, including that of Gauleiter, or district leader, for the Upper Palatinate and Lower Bavaria. But that's not all. Hitler also assigned him the task of structuring a small personal protection corps, a sort of internal security service for the party. During those years, the National Socialist Party relied on the enormous militant machine of the SA, the so-called brown shirts. These paramilitary formations had the task not only of openly fighting in the streets against socialists, communists, and social democrats, but also of spreading a climate of widespread and systematic violence against Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Freemasons, and all political or ideological opponents. Heinrich Himmler was then assigned the responsibility of reorganizing a small unit, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, literally protection squad, with the task of serving as Hitler's personal bodyguard. Soon Himmler began to distrust the SA. He considered them too chaotic, uncontrollable, overly aggressive, and above all, too numerous. It's at this point that Himmler had the decisive insight: the SS needed to be something completely different, not an indistinguishable mass, but an elite, a selected formation that would embody and represent, in its purest form, the ideal of the Aryan new man, so dear to the Führer's vision. With this new philosophy, the SS began to strengthen, to structure themselves around Hitler's figure, becoming increasingly similar to a true Praetorian Guard. Concrete proof came in 1934, with the so-called Night of the Long Knives. In just 48 hours between the end of June and the beginning of July, having just consolidated power, Hitler decided to settle accounts with Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA. The operation was conducted by the SS themselves, who escorted Hitler to the spa locations where the brown shirt leadership was staying. They were arrested, imprisoned, and in many cases, summarily executed. Not just the SA leaders, other inconvenient opponents were also eliminated, such as Gregor Strasser, guilty of having tried to obstruct Hitler and aspiring to the position of vice-chancellor, and then various politicians and journalists who had gotten in the Führer's way. They too silenced forever by the SS. And then came the major innovations: the camps. But what kind of camps are we talking about? Starting in 1933, the SS initiated the construction of the first large concentration camp at Dachau, near Munich. It was the first of its kind, an experimental model destined to become a prototype to be replicated throughout Germany, and later beyond its borders. These camps were not born with the intention to re-educate or temporarily detain. They were not prisons in the classical sense. They were places of slow elimination, where people died from hardship, disease, beatings, shootings, or hangings. They were designed to break, to destroy, to make the so-called enemies of the Reich disappear without fanfare. Himmler knew perfectly well every detail of what happened behind those gates. It was he himself who proposed to Hitler, when ordinary prisons began to fill up, the opening of new camps, new places to intern the undesirables, those whom the regime considered an existential threat: communists, political opponents, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, dissidents. These were not common criminals, neither thieves nor murderers in the legal sense. Those who ended up in the camps were ideological enemies, people guilty only of existing in the wrong way, according to Nazi logic. And even if no one publicly admitted it, everyone knew. From those camps, there was no exit, because they were created to kill. Systematically, silently. After the fall of the SS grew immensely. They grew so much that even Himmler realized he could no longer manage them as an improvised paramilitary group. A structure was needed, a solid, articulated organization, and so Himmler gave form to a complex administrative machine, dividing it into operational and hierarchical sections. Among these, the most important had an imposing acronym, RHA, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office. A high-sounding name, certainly. Excessive, one might say. But behind that acronym hid a vast apparatus, a true bureaucracy of terror. The RHA included everything: a personnel office, an administrative one for logistics, in short, like a large enterprise. But above all, it housed the operational nerves of the regime: the SIPO, the security police, the Gestapo, the infamous secret police, the Kripo, the criminal police, and the Foreign Secret Service. Leading this monstrous organism was Reinhard Heydrich, one of Himmler's most ruthless collaborators. A cold, calculating, merciless man. Around him, he gathered a group of loyalists, men who would become protagonists in the worst atrocities of contemporary history. There was Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of Jewish deportation. There was Bruno Streckenbach, who after the war would become, incredibly, director of department stores in Hamburg, causing scandal. There was Alfred Naujoks, the man who staged the fake attack on the Gleiwitz radio station, providing Hitler with the pretext to invade Poland. There was Bernhard Kruger, the state forger, mind behind Operation Bernhard, tasked with flooding the Allies with counterfeit pounds and dollars. And then Walter Schellenberg, master of espionage, famous for the Venlo incident. All men in the service of Heydrich, or of Heinrich Himmler, the direct head of the Gestapo. But that's not all. There was also another fundamental sector, the Central Directorate for Economic Affairs, entrusted to Richard Glucks. Not particularly brilliant, Glucks nevertheless had a key quality. He intuited how to economically exploit everything the SS managed to seize. Every time an enemy of the Reich was arrested, their assets were confiscated. And to whom did these assets go? To the SS, who not only managed them but made them an economic resource. In a short time, the Black Order transformed into a financial empire: factories, construction companies, chemical companies, travel agencies. The SS also became an industrial power, capable of generating frightening profits thanks to the systematic theft of internees' property and the slave labor from the camps. Horrifying? Yes. But it's reality. It got to the point where Himmler, who meanwhile, with the outbreak of war, had also assumed a military position, pushed to create an armed SS corps. It began with a first motorized nucleus, which then evolved into the Waffen-SS. Himmler immediately intuited that all this could become an inexhaustible source of wealth. Imagine any SS prisoner. If it's a Russian or a Pole, there's little to gain. They have nothing with them. But if it's a Jew, and Jews at that time often traveled carrying at least part of their assets, they are stripped of everything. Shoes, clothes, everything. They are given the prisoner uniform. The clothing is inventoried, shoe size, clothing size, all disinfected and then resold. The suitcases, their contents, gold, silver bearer bonds, are requisitioned. Precious items are melted down or evaluated by expert jewelers and then sold. or they end up in the private collections of the hierarchy. The artworks, also requisitioned, often end up in the private galleries of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, known for his pronounced taste for art. The proceeds from all this, they go directly into the pockets of the hierarchs or into SS bank deposits, always under his control, that little man with round glasses, a round face, almost cherubic, the one who, during inspections of concentration camps, demands maximum efficiency but never wants to witness an execution. That same Himmler, who during rare visits to the death squads, those following the German army during the invasion of the Soviet Union, always tried to avoid seeing the executions. Only on a couple of occasions did he witness them directly, and he came out shocked, felt ill, almost couldn't bear the sight of blood. Incredible. For an executioner, fully aware of what was happening by his order. But that's how Himmler was. Yet he didn't stop there. His ambitions were also political. After Rudolf Hess, Hitler's secretary and heir apparent, fled to Scotland, officially to negotiate a separate peace with the British. The circle of trusted individuals around Hitler narrowed. From that moment, Hitler trusted only 4 people: Martin Bormann, party secretary; Göring, Reich Marshal; Goebbels, propaganda minister; and Himmler, head of the SS. These 4, often competing with each other, particularly Bormann and Göring, became the Führer's principal advisors, even in military matters. Himmler at one point obtained permission to transform the SS into a true Praetorian order: motorized infantry divisions, mechanized, armored, mountain. Permission was granted on condition that they always remain an elite. Recruitment in the first divisions, like the infamous Das Reich Division, protagonist of war crimes in France, took place on strictly racial grounds. One could enter the Waffen-SS only if one belonged to one of the 3 ethnic groups into which Himmler divided German society: pure Nordic Aryan, phallic, or harmonious bastard, with Nordic prevalence. With these characteristics, one gained access to the elite corps of the Waffen-SS, which received the best training, the best weapons, priority in the assignment of new arms. They were the first, worldwide, to experiment with the use of camouflage uniforms. Members of the Waffen-SS, like those of the Totenkopfverband, the SS guarding concentration camps, also had priority for blood transfusions. Their blood type was tattooed under the armpit, to be immediately identified in case of injury. An elite corps, yes, but born with dark intentions, which degraded more and more, even in the selection of men. What was meant to be a symbol of Aryan precepts began to open up to increasingly indiscriminate recruitment. It started with the Volksdeutscher, populations from Allied or occupied countries with German roots, like the ethnic German colonists from Transylvania, Baltics, Lithuanians. Then it went further: Ukrainians, Belarusians, Dutch, Belgians, followers of Leon Degrelle. They even came to constitute an Italian legion of the armed wing of Hitler's protection squadron, and even an entire mountain division composed largely of Bosnian volunteers of Muslim religion, recruited also thanks to the good offices of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Within the Waffen-SS, an almost mystical dimension of belonging was born. When on July 20, 1944, Colonel von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler as part of Operation Valkyrie, Himmler escaped the attack, although he was initially one of the targets, and from that moment was appointed supreme commander of the armed forces. Hitler, by then, no longer trusted the generals. He trusted only him, the faithful Himmler. So faithful, yet lucid. Himmler harbored no illusions about the outcome of the war. Already in the autumn of 1944, some of his emissaries met in Strasbourg with representatives of major German industries. They began planning the escape. The Reich had months, perhaps weeks left. Funds were not lacking. Part of them had been stolen from Jews and other camp prisoners. Part came from requisitions. Still others were made available by industrialists. Terrified at the idea of being expropriated
created by the victorious Allies. Everything was organized methodically, like a major logistical operation. The routes were already prepared: Spain, Portugal, Argentina, Paraguay. Even Brazil and Egypt indicated willingness to welcome fugitive criminals. Himmler, too, sought a way out. In April 1945, when the Thousand-Year Reich was falling to pieces, he began openly negotiating, after months of secret contacts, with Folke Bernadotte, the Swedish Count Emissary of the future United Nations. What did he offer? The lives of tens of thousands of prisoners who had survived the camps. What did he ask in return? Safety for himself and his collaborators. He knew well he was at the top of the wanted list. If captured by the Anglo-Americans, he would be tried and hanged. If he fell to the Soviets, he would be tortured and shot. There were no alternatives, either the gallows or an atrocious end in a cell. When Hitler discovered the talks, he exploded. He felt betrayed by one of the few in whom he still had confidence. He dismissed him, even ordered the SS to arrest him. But the Reich was collapsing. No one was following orders anymore, not even those of the Führer. On May 4th, 1945, the day after Hitler's suicide, Himmler presented himself to Karl Dönitz, the new Reich president. He asked for a role in the government, tried to impose himself as the last of the great hierarchs, still standing. But he obtained nothing. When Dönitz and General Jodl signed the surrender at Flensburg, Himmler officially became a fugitive. He fled with his most trusted men, Joseph Kiermaier, his bodyguard, assistant Rudolf Brandt, 2 major aides, and the diabolical doctor of Ravensbrück, Karl Franz Gebarth, of the same stamp as Joseph Mengele. With this detachment, he moved between Flensburg on the border with Denmark and Hamburg. They walked through forests, crossed small villages. The Allies, in those days, had only scattered patrols trying to intercept stragglers. And it was in one of these villages that Himmler's patrol was captured. He had tried to disguise himself, to change his identity, like many of his former subordinates. He wore a Wehrmacht coat, a helmet, pretending to be a former stray soldier. He called himself Heinrich Himmler, a carefully chosen name, but one that was not enough to hide his chubby face and those unmistakable round glasses. The English patrol led him, along with his group, to a nearby prisoner camp. It was there that something unexpected happened. Himmler asked to speak with the camp commander. The officer, who already harbored suspicions about his true identity, listened as Himmler revealed who he really was. He requested a private conversation, offering alleged information in exchange for preferential treatment. Some suggest that he wanted to talk about hidden treasures, secret documents on the Reich's scientific experiments, or the German atomic program. But he wasn't believed. He wasn't taken seriously. The next day, during an interrogation, while being searched for documents or poison capsules, Himmler took the extreme step. He bit the capsule he had hidden between 2 molars, a capsule of potassium cyanide, implanted long ago as a last resort in case of capture. Within a few seconds, his body was shaken by violent convulsions. The English immediately realized what was happening. The smell of cyanide was unmistakable. They tried to intervene. They transported him to the infirmary, attempted a gastric lavage, all useless. Himmler's agony lasted about 10 minutes, then he died, without fanfare, without glory. His death surprised everyone, including British and American intelligence services, who began to investigate and suspect each other. That man, after all, would have been a key witness at the future Nuremberg trials. The body was buried in a forest near Lüneburg. No tomb, no headstone. The burial remained anonymous, reportedly to prevent that place from becoming a meeting point for Nazi nostalgics, to prevent the birth of a cult, but perhaps also to keep Soviet hands away, who might have demanded the exhumation of the corpse to examine it. What is certain is that Himmler took all his contradictions to the grave. He was a butcher without ever pulling a trigger. A soldier without ever having truly fought. A thief without ever having put his hands in anyone's pocket. A faithful executor of orders who in the end transformed into a traitor. He professed devotion to eugenics, promoting the Lebensborn Project, the farms of life where the new Aryan race was supposed to be selected. Yet he himself did not embody that ideal. He was a third level, a harmonious bastard, as they defined it. Far from the image of the tall, thin, blonde German with blue eyes and square features, Himmler, the man who founded the Black Order, the symbol of an era of terror that lasted more than 15 years. Difficult to forget, not only for Germany, but for all of Europe. He was Hitler's advisor, his bodyguard, his military attaché, the man who built a ruthless, scientific, glacial repressive system, and who finally, at the decisive moment, chose to die in the most anonymous way possible, biting a cyanide capsule to leave behind nothing but dust.